Hi.
Hi again. We're in the Search for Christian Freedom on page 9. And in this analysis, Franz starts his first subheading in the chapter, Where the Difference Lies, talking about the difference between apparent benefits from being in a religion like the Watchtower, where you're freed from something, to the ultimate benefit, where you have to be more than freed from, you have to be freed towards something. Right. And here's how he puts it in about the question itself. The question remains then, whatever the apparent benefits gained, at what cost have they been gained? Has their integration into the witness organization eventually resulted in a forfeiture of freedom to express truth, faith, and love in a way that is uncoerced and unrestrained by human domination? So in the next section, under Where the Difference Lies, he takes us back 500 years to the Reformation. Ray starts this way. Several centuries ago, at the time of the Reformation, a time when many persons felt bound by conscience to reject ecclesiastical domination over their lives and their faith, one of them expressed the position of the Christian in this way. And now he quotes from Martin Luther in his treatise on the freedom of the Christian man. Luther says this: a Christian man is a free lord over everything and subject to no one. But then, Luther also says, a Christian man is an obedient servant in everything and subject to everyone. This sounds contradictory, but it is not. It basically paraphrases the Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 9.
9:19. I am a free man and own no master, but I have made myself every man's servant to win over as many as possible. The difference here is between a submission that is extracted by men who claim a superior position and who insist on submission to their authority, as contrasted with a submission and service that springs freely and spontaneously from one's own heart. It is a submission and service that results not from yielding to others' claims and their demands, but from seeing other persons' needs and the good that can result. Paul recognized only one God-appointed head and master, Christ, and owned no other, whether a single man or a group of men.
Of some who tried to assume such authority, he said, and here he quotes from the Jerusalem Bible, they have furtively crept in to spy on the liberty we enjoy in Christ Jesus, and want to reduce us all to slavery. I was so determined to safeguard for you the true meaning of the good news that I refused even out of deference to yield to such people for one moment. And he also inserts into there, from Phillips' modern English translation, as an equivalent to the phrase, reducing us all to slavery, Phillips says, attempted to tie us up with rules and regulations. And then Ray goes on, the apostle did not view lightly the loss of Christian liberty through religious domination. When he wrote the words quoted at the start of this chapter, it was to people who were letting themselves be misled by a false gospel or good news. That's Galatians, by the way, at the beginning of the chapter, Galatians chapter 5, if you want to check it. In his day, it was the effort to reimpose the law covenant upon Christians as obligatory that notably threatened their freedom in Christ. Wherein lay the grave danger. The law being urged upon Christians was, after all, the very same law that Jehovah himself gave through Moses. Why then would Paul say that its reimposition would lead to being, quote, burdened again by a yoke of slavery, unquote?
Part of the danger lay in the fact that such submission to law would inevitably allow for and bring into play the role of men who act as interpreters of the law. Their interpretations taking on the force of rules with judicial bodies, religious courts, applying those rules and imposing sanctions as enforcers of the law. That would mean the reinstitution of a human priesthood over Christian believers, who had but one superior priest and mediator, God's Son. Why then did some men in the first century Christian congregation work to reintroduce law-keeping. Evidently, the reason was that, consciously or subconsciously, they wanted to exercise control and authority over others. They sought power over fellow Christians, and one way to gain this was by interposing themselves between Christians and their rightful head, Christ. This was in fulfillment of Paul's prophecy recorded at Acts 20, verses 29 and 30. I know that after my going away, oppressive wolves will enter in among you, and will not treat the flock with tenderness. And from among you yourselves men will rise and speak twisted things, to draw away the disciples after themselves.
Their arguments were plausible, had the sound of logic, and Paul shows that many of their hearers were being convinced, accepting this as gospel truth. The proponents of law-keeping could argue that God requires holiness, righteousness, which is true, and that without the imposition of law, people simply will not hold to righteousness, which may be true of most people, but which should not be true of Christians. As an opening wedge, they urged circumcision, something instituted by God himself nearly 2,000 years earlier in Abraham's time. Once this base was accepted, however, they built on it the tradition of other features of the law, presented as necessary to be right with God, to maintain a clean congregation.
Mm-hmm. When we read this over, I did object a little to one thing that Ray says here, or at least I think he's underestimating the Jewishness of the early Christians, and the fact that the ones that were Jewish Christians had continued to follow their Jewish customs, going to synagogue. They continued those things. It was the imposition of these Christian Jews to want the Gentile Christians to also continue, or to start up and be Jewish as well as Christian. That was the problem. So I don't think it was so much a desire for control as for people who have grown up and have a tradition and a history of years
way of worship,
of worshiping in a certain way. They don't just abandon it because they believe what they had been seeking and praying for and looking for was the Messiah, which was promised in the very law and books that they treasured.
And the evidence of Acts is that they went right on in Judea.
Yeah, so
thousands of them worshiping with their fellow Jews who were not yet Christians.
So you see that with James, and in his book, if you read his book. So we can't think of it as James being power hungry.
Well, in the footnotes to this page, Ray does bring up Matthew 23 and Acts 15, where James himself mentions the fact that this burden Jews could not carry. If the gospel becomes burdensome, then it's no longer freedom, is it?
Yeah.
So James is only amplifying what his brother, his half-brother Jesus had said, namely that you, to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, you load heavy burdens on the shoulders of men, but you yourselves cannot move them.
As if these things could save. They couldn't save them. And that was recognized by the Jewish Christians.
Yeah.
That the law didn't save you, but it certainly was a good guide.
Yeah. Well, Paul says the law is perfect in Romans as well. So he's not saying it's the law that's the problem. So it's a matter of the emphasis and the focus, which we'll deal with in the next segment.